Hi everyone, for tonight's Nightcap and review, I'm having water, and tonight I'll be discussing They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. This was my nonfiction audiobook that I got through the Libby app. Of course, I'm giving my honest opinion, and I'm giving this 5 stars. This was definitely an educational read that I would highly recommend. But before we get into all of that, what's this book about? Now, to make sure I don't misrepresent or misspeak about what this book's about, I'm going to read the synopsis straight from the Zon. Bridging women's history, the history of the South, and African American history, this book makes a bold argument about the role of white women in American slavery. Historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers draws on a variety of sources to show that slave owning women were sophisticated economic actors who directly engaged in and benefited from the South's slave market. Because women typically inherited more slaves and land, enslaved people were often their primary source of wealth. Not only did white women often refuse to cede ownership of their slaves to their husband, they employed management techniques that were as effective and brutal as those used by slave owning men. White women actively participated in the slave market, profited from it, and used it for economic and social empowerment. By examining these economically entangled lives of enslaved people and slave owning women, Jones Rogers presents a narrative that forces us to rethink the economics and social conventions of slave owning America. So, what are my thoughts? Again, I'm giving this 5 stars. Now, this book, like so many other nonfictions I've read recently, was really eye opening and I would highly recommend it. I was definitely under the mindset, like so many others, as this book goes to point out, is that we were operating under the assumption that women in the South during this time were just under the patriarchy. They weren't allowed to own property and they were under their husband's thumb, so they had no real say in the buying and selling of enslaved people and their treatment. And in a way, that's just infantilizing them as women, that they were just so helpless under this system that they had no real say in anything and just never truly witnessed the horrors because as women, that's not their place and they weren't allowed there. And this book uses several examples and goes on to explain that in fact that's not true, and it was in fact the exact opposite, that this is one of the few areas where women were allowed to have control and say and amass their own wealth separate from their husband. And as with a lot of things, wealth means one set of rules for one people and a different set of rules for other people. And for white women under the patriarchy, when you had wealth, the rules were different for you. Now, one of the first things to stun me is that this is one of the few ways that women could actually exert control over men, including their husbands, when it came to enforcing their property rights over their enslaved people. And what I mean by that is that women were actually allowed to set the rules and standards by which the men in their life were allowed to interact with their property. A wife is allowed to tell their husband, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that. Hey, I want to house them separate because I want our property to be completely separate, as well as, no, you can't discipline him, and you certainly can't discipline him that way. And anytime a man, including her husband, would overstep her rules and boundaries, if she had no other recourse, she was actually allowed to take him to court. And a court would recognize a woman's authority over her husband's when it came to her property, especially if there was a clear contract. But even in instances where there was an invalid or no contract, a court would actually seek out ways of proving a woman's claim, which included interviewing the people surrounding her, as well as the enslaved people, whose usually enslaved people's testimony was not recognized because they were seen as property. But they would actually take that testimony into account, like, hey, your previous owner, did he want to leave you to his daughter? He did. Okay, she's the legal owner, even though there is no contract. And the courts would recognize that and rule in the favor of the woman and have the man pay restitution. And I just found that really eye-opening, that there were so many legal avenues of proving a woman's right of property over these enslaved individuals. And that makes me wonder if this is like some generational thing as to why white women are so comfortable going to the cops and going through the court systems to prove, to exert control, because this is one of the few avenues under the patriarchy where women were allowed to exert control over men, and it usually ruled in our favor. And I just found that really eye-opening. There was a lot of things in this book that was eye-opening, and I can't recommend this book enough, and I am going to I am going to be getting a copy for my shelves because I listened to this as an audiobook, and I would really recommend this book. Now, it is currently available, so definitely check it out, and I hope everyone has a good night and happy readings.